The unit stood frozen as Staff Sergeant Damon Pritchard's voice echoed through the Veterans Integration Center, his finger jabbing toward the woman in worn jeans and a faded jacket. None of them realized they were witnessing a career-ending mistake, or that the quiet civilian he was berating had been sent directly by the Inspector General. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton's main parade ground as Claudia Shepherd pulled her 15-year-old sedan into the visitor parking lot. At 38, she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of military service, though nothing about her appearance suggested the authority she wielded. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her civilian clothes, well-worn jeans, a plain gray jacket, and scuffed hiking boots, were deliberately chosen to blend in, to observe without being observed. Fort Braxton sprawled across 3,000 acres of Virginia countryside, home to over 12,000 active-duty personnel and support staff. It was also, according to 17 formal complaints filed over the past 8 months, home to a toxic culture of intimidation that the chain of command had systematically ignored. Claudia's office, the Office of the Inspector General, had received detailed allegations of discrimination, harassment, and abuse of authority within the 3rd Battalion's administrative section. The complaints painted a disturbing picture of soldiers afraid to come forward, of witnesses who watched wrongdoing in silence, of a command climate where rank was weaponized against the vulnerable. Today marked the beginning of an investigation that would either validate those concerns or put them to rest. But Claudia wouldn't be arriving in her lieutenant colonel uniform with an entourage of investigators. She had learned long ago that the truth rarely revealed itself to official delegations announced days in advance. Real understanding came from seeing how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Her partner in this operation, Captain Felix Garrison, was already on post. Felix had been assigned to Fort Braxton for 6 months as part of the Inspector General's field team, his true purpose known only to the base commander, Colonel Gwendolyn Merritt. Felix had spent those months carefully building a profile of the 3rd Battalion's culture, documenting patterns of behavior, identifying key players. His reports had been thorough and deeply troubling. According to Felix, Staff Sergeant Damon Pritchard ran the battalion's administrative office like a personal fiefdom, wielding his 12 years of service and close relationship with Major Hugh Randolph as shields against accountability. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Claudia would arrive as a veteran seeking assistance with her VA disability claim, a common enough occurrence that it would raise no suspicions. She would interact with the administrative staff, particularly Pritchard, under circumstances that would reveal their true character. Her partner in this operation, Captain Felix Garrison, would be present but maintaining his cover as a junior officer assigned to support services, and they would see whether the culture of intimidation existed only in written complaints or manifested in daily interactions. Claudia locked her car and walked toward the Veterans Integration Center, a renovated building at the edge of the main post that served as a bridge between active duty and civilian life. The center provided transitioning soldiers and veterans with access to employment resources, educational counseling, and assistance navigating the often bewildering bureaucracy of veterans' benefits. It was meant to be a place of support and dignity. According to the complaints Claudia had reviewed, it had become something else entirely under Pritchard's influence. The automatic doors opened with a soft whoosh, revealing a waiting area designed to project warmth and accessibility. Comfortable chairs arranged in small clusters, walls decorated with photos of smiling veterans at graduation ceremonies and job fairs, informational posters about education benefits and healthcare options. A young specialist sat at the reception desk, her nameplate reading, Specialist Trina Jefferson. She looked up as Claudia entered, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes.
"Good morning," Claudia said, approaching the desk with the slightly uncertain manner of someone unfamiliar with military bureaucracy. "I'm here to get some help with my disability claim. I was told this was the right place?" Trina's expression softened slightly. "Yes, ma'am, you're in the right place. Do you have an appointment? No, I'm sorry, Claudia replied, injecting just the right note of apology into her voice. I drove down from Richmond. I didn't realize I needed to schedule ahead. Is there any way someone could see me today? I took the day off work. Trina glanced at her computer screen, then toward a hallway leading deeper into the building. Something flickered across her face. Concern, perhaps, or wariness. Let me check with the staff duty office, if you could just have a seat for a moment. As Claudia settled into one of the waiting room chairs, she observed the environment with trained attention. Two other veterans sat across the room, both appearing to be in their late 20s or early 30s. One filled out paperwork with focused concentration. The other stared at his phone, but his rigid posture suggested tension rather than relaxation. Through a window, she could see into what appeared to be a small counseling office where a female soldier spoke earnestly with a middle-aged veteran, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but marked by visible emotion on the veteran's face. The building felt well-maintained and professionally run on the surface. But Claudia had learned to look for subtler signs. The way Trina had hesitated before checking on availability, the tension in the waiting veteran's shoulders, the fact that the counseling session was taking place behind glass walls where it could be easily monitored from the hallway. Footsteps approached from the corridor, heavy and deliberate. A man emerged into the waiting area, his combat uniform pressed to razor-sharp perfection, his bearing radiating authority and something else, an edge of aggressive confidence that immediately put Claudia on alert. Staff Sergeant Damon Pritchard matched the physical description from Felix's reports. 6 feet tall, powerfully built, with close cropped hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw set in permanent skepticism. His uniform displayed multiple deployment patches and a combat infantry badge, credentials that commanded respect in military culture. He also wore them like armor, his entire presence declaring that he had earned the right to judge others. "You the walk-in?" Pritchard asked, his tone making it clear that walk-ins were an inconvenience he tolerated rather than welcomed. Claudia stood, maintaining her posture of respectful uncertainty. "Yes, I'm Claudia Shepherd. I was hoping to get some help with my disability claim." Pritchard's gaze swept over her with undespised assessment, taking in her civilian clothes, her aged vehicle visible through the window, her lack of obvious affluence or connections. His expression shifted subtly but unmistakably toward dismissiveness. "You should have made an appointment. We're not a drop-in clinic." "I apologize. I didn't understand the process. If I could just speak with someone for a few minutes." "Everyone thinks their issue is an emergency," Pritchard interrupted, crossing his arms across his chest. "But we have priorities here. Active duty soldiers come first, then scheduled appointments, then maybe, if there's time, walk-ins who couldn't be bothered to follow procedures." The words themselves might have been justifiable. Prioritization was a necessary part of managing limited resources. But the delivery was calculated to demean, to establish dominance, to remind Claudia that she was the supplicant and he was the gatekeeper. Across the room, the two waiting veterans had gone very still. Trina's face remained carefully neutral, but her fingers gripped her pen more tightly. And Claudia understood, with the clarity of long experience, that she was witnessing exactly what the complaints had described. This is how it began, with small demonstrations of power, with subtle assertions of authority, with the establishment of who mattered and who did not.
Claudia maintained her composure, though she allowed a flicker of disappointment to cross her face. "I understand priorities, Staff Sergeant. I'm a veteran myself. I served 8 years before transitioning out. I just thought maybe someone could point me in the right direction, help me understand what documents I need." Pritchard's eyebrows rose slightly, though his expression remained skeptical. 8 years? What was your MOS? The question came with the tone of someone preparing to catch her in a lie, to expose her as one of those civilians who claimed military service they'd never actually completed. 68W, Claudia replied, using the military occupational specialty code for combat medic. "I deployed twice to Afghanistan with the 101st Airborne. Got out as a sergeant in 2019. Every word was true, though it represented only a fraction of her actual service record.
Her lieutenant colonel rank came from a direct commission after she'd earned her master's degree and joined the Inspector General's Corps, but that information remained carefully omitted. Something shifted in Pritchard's demeanor, though it wasn't quite respect. More like a recalculation of how much contempt he could display. Combat medics occupied a complex space in military culture, respected for their battlefield role, but often dismissed in garrison environments. 68W, he repeated. Then you should know how the system works. You file your claim through the VA. We don't do that here. I filed, Claudia explained, maintaining her patient tone, 3 months ago, but I haven't heard anything back and I'm having trouble understanding what happens next. The VA website says veterans can get assistance at military installations, and Fort Braxton's website lists the center as a resource for claim support. Pritchard's jaw tightened. Being contradicted, even politely and with documented facts, clearly ranked among his least favorite experiences. The website isn't always current. Our primary mission is supporting active duty personnel with their transition process. We help veterans when we have capacity, but we're not a full-service VA office. I'm not asking for full service, Claudia replied, allowing a note of frustration to enter her voice, the kind of frustration any veteran might feel when bureaucracy seemed designed to exhaust rather than assist. I'm asking for guidance. Maybe someone who can look at my paperwork and tell me if I'm missing something obvious. Behind Pritchard, a door opened, and Captain Felix Garrison emerged carrying a folder and wearing the slightly harried expression of a junior officer managing too many tasks. His eyes passed over Claudia without recognition, a performance they'd practiced until it appeared entirely natural. Staff Sergeant Pritchard, do you have those training rosters Major Randolph requested? Pritchard turned, his posture shifting immediately to something more deferential. Not yet, sir. Sergeant Carlisle was supposed to compile them this morning. The Major needs them by 1100, Felix said, his tone mild but carrying the weight of officer authority. That's in 90 minutes. Understood, sir. I'll track down Carlisle. Pritchard glanced back at Claudia, dismissal clear in his expression. Ma'am, like I said, you need to work through the VA's system. We can't help you today. He moved toward the corridor without waiting for a response, his attention already shifted to the task an officer had assigned. Felix watched him go, then seemed to notice Claudia for the first time. Excuse me, were you waiting for assistance? His question was directed to Claudia, but included Specialist Jefferson in its scope. Trina spoke up before Claudia could respond. This is Miss Shepherd, sir. She's a veteran seeking help with her disability claim. She doesn't have an appointment. Felix's expression shifted to one of professional concern. A disability claim? Did you serve at Fort Braxton?
No, sir, Claudia replied. I was with the 101st. But I'm living in Richmond now, and your website indicated this center could provide support. Felix nodded slowly, seeming to consider the situation. Our website should probably be more specific about what services we offer, walk-ins versus scheduled appointments. He glanced at his watch, then at Trina. How's the schedule looking for the rest of the morning? Trina checked her computer. Sergeant Carlisle has a break between appointments from 10 a.m. to 10:30, and Specialist Caldwell is doing administrative work this morning. She could potentially spare some time. Let's see if Specialist Caldwell can do an initial consultation, Felix decided. At minimum, she can review Miss Shepherd's paperwork and provide some guidance on next steps. He turned to Claudia. Would that be helpful? Very helpful, sir. Thank you. Claudia's gratitude was genuine, though not for the reasons Felix appeared to believe. This interaction demonstrated something important. When an officer was present, when someone with rank showed interest, the system suddenly discovered capacity and flexibility that Staff Sergeant Pritchard had insisted didn't exist. Felix nodded to Trina. Please let Specialist Caldwell know. Then to Claudia, it might be a short wait. There's coffee in the corner if you'd like some. As Felix disappeared back down the corridor, Trina picked up her phone with visible relief. Specialist Caldwell, yes, ma'am. Captain Garrison is asking if you can do a consultation with a walk-in veteran. Disability claim. Guidance. Maybe 20 minutes? Okay, I'll let her know.
Trina hung up and offered Claudia a warmer smile than before. Specialist Caldwell will be ready in about 10 minutes. She's just finishing up some paperwork. Thank you, Claudia said, settling back into her chair. As she waited, she observed the subtle dynamics playing out around her. The other two veterans in the waiting room had visibly relaxed once Pritchard left. One of them caught Claudia's eye and offered a small knowing shake of his head, a gesture that seemed to say, yeah, he's like that with everyone. Through the glass wall, the counseling session had concluded. The veteran who'd been receiving assistance emerged with paperwork clutched tightly, his expression suggesting the interaction had been helpful. The female soldier who'd conducted the session, Specialist Amber Caldwell, according to the nameplate now visible, began straightening her office with efficient movements. Specialist Caldwell appeared younger than Claudia had expected, perhaps 24 or 25, with her dark hair in a regulation bun and a professional demeanor that seemed both genuine and slightly guarded. When she emerged into the waiting area, her approach carried none of Pritchard's aggressive authority. "Miss Shepherd, I'm Specialist Caldwell. I understand you need some guidance with a VA disability claim?" "Yes, if you have time. I don't want to take you away from more important work." Something flickered in Caldwell's eyes. Appreciation, perhaps, for the courtesy, or recognition of the implicit reference to Pritchard's priority speech. "Helping veterans is exactly what I'm here for," she said simply. "Let's go to my office and see what we can figure out." As Claudia followed Specialist Caldwell down the corridor, she noticed Sergeant Evan Carlisle emerging from another office, his attention fixed on his phone. He glanced up as they passed, his gaze sliding over Claudia with the same dismissive assessment Pritchard had performed. Whatever culture existed in this office, it clearly extended beyond one problematic staff sergeant.
Specialist Caldwell's office was small but organized, with filing cabinets lining one wall and a modest desk positioned to allow face-to-face conversations without the barrier of furniture between counselor and client. A framed quote hung on the wall: "Service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on Earth." Muhammad Ali's words seemed to capture something essential about Caldwell's approach to her work. "Please, have a seat," Caldwell said, gesturing to a comfortable chair positioned at an angle to her desk. "Can I see what documentation you've brought?" Claudia produced a folder from her worn canvas bag containing paperwork that reflected a genuine disability claim she'd prepared specifically for this investigation. The medical records were real. She did have a service-connected back injury from her years as a combat medic. The claim was legitimate, filed through proper channels months ago as part of establishing her cover. "I filed 3 months ago for a back injury sustained during deployment. I keep checking the VA website, but the status hasn't changed from gathering evidence. I don't know if that's normal or if something's wrong with my claim." Caldwell opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents with practiced efficiency. 3 months is actually pretty typical for the evidence-gathering phase, especially for musculoskeletal claims. They often need to request service medical records and sometimes schedule additional examinations. She pulled out a document. "I see you included your DD-214 and service medical records. That's good. Did you also submit a personal statement describing how the injury affects your daily life?" "I did," Claudia confirmed. "Is there a way to check if they received everything?" As Caldwell began explaining the VA's online tracking system, voices rose in the corridor outside. Through the glass wall of the office, Claudia could see Staff Sergeant Pritchard standing near the reception area, his posture aggressive, speaking to someone just out of view. His voice carried clearly despite the closed door. "I don't care what your excuse is. You had a 0900 appointment, and it's now 0945. That's 45 minutes of disrespect for everyone else's time." Caldwell's expression tightened, but she continued her explanation, raising her voice slightly to be heard over Pritchard's increasingly loud tirade. "If you log into the VA website using your DS Logon credentials, you can see you think your time is more valuable than everyone else's? You think the rules don't apply to you?" Through the glass, a woman came into view. Another veteran, probably in her mid-50s, her shoulders hunched as she clutched a folder to her chest. Her lips moved in what appeared to be an explanation or apology, but Pritchard spoke over her. Caldwell stood abruptly. Excuse me for just a moment, Miss Shepherd. She opened her office door and stepped into the corridor. Staff Sergeant Pritchard, can I help with something? Pritchard turned, his expression making clear that Caldwell's intervention was unwelcome. This doesn't concern you, Specialist. I'm addressing a failure to respect scheduled appointments. Ma'am, Caldwell addressed the older veteran directly, her voice gentle. Are you here for the employment counseling session? The woman nodded, her voice barely audible. I got lost on post. The gate guard gave me directions, but I took a wrong turn. I'm so sorry for being late. That's completely understandable, Caldwell assured her. Fort Braxton can be confusing for visitors. Why don't you come with me? She's 45 minutes late, Pritchard interjected, stepping closer to the woman in a movement that was clearly intended to intimidate. 45 minutes. Do you know how many veterans we could have helped in 45 minutes? The woman's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause problems. Maybe I should just go.
Claudia rose from her chair, her investigator's instincts overriding her need to maintain cover. She stepped out of Caldwell's office, her presence drawing Pritchard's attention. Staff Sergeant, she explained, what happened? Getting lost on an unfamiliar military installation is a reasonable explanation for being late. Pritchard's gaze swung to Claudia, his expression darkening. And who asked for your input? You're not even supposed to be here. You're a walk-in who Captain Garrison took pity on. I'm a veteran, Claudia replied, keeping her voice level, just like this woman, and I think she deserves to be treated with basic respect. Respect? Pritchard's voice rose another notch, and other personnel began emerging from offices to witness the confrontation. Sergeant Carlyle appeared from around the corner, stopping to observe with his arms crossed. Two more soldiers, Corporal Tyson Bradshaw and another specialist, positioned themselves where they could watch without directly participating. Customer service? This is the United States Army, not a shopping mall. We have standards. We have procedures. And when people can't follow simple instructions or show up on time or dress appropriately, there are consequences. The older veteran had begun backing toward the exit, clearly wanting nothing more than to escape. Caldwell moved to intercept her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. Please don't leave. We can still help you. No, it's okay. I don't want to cause any more trouble. See that? Pritchard gestured at the retreating veteran. That's someone who understands she wasted our time, unlike some people who think they're entitled to special treatment just because they claim to have served. The phrase, claim to have served, landed like a physical blow. Around the corridor, the watching shoulders shifted uncomfortably. Corporal Bradshaw's expression suggested he wanted to intervene but couldn't figure out how without violating the unspoken rules about challenging a senior NCO. I'm not claiming anything, Claudia said, her voice hardening despite her best efforts to maintain composure. I served honorably. I deployed in combat. And I deserve better than this. So does she. She gestured toward the older veteran, who had reached the waiting area and was now gathering her belongings to leave. Pritchard's smile was cold and triumphant. You know what I think? I think you are exactly the kind of person who makes everyone else's job harder. Entitled, demanding, acting like the world owes you something because you put on a uniform once. The insult was designed to provoke, to push Claudia into a reaction that would justify whatever Pritchard planned to do next. Around them, the audience of soldiers watched with varying expressions, some uncomfortable, others carefully neutral, a few openly approving of their staff sergeant's dominance. Claudia took a measured breath, forcing herself to remain calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. 20 years of military service had taught her how to recognize when a situation was spiraling toward a breaking point, and every instinct told her they were approaching that threshold. Staff Sergeant, I think we should step back and— Don't tell me what we should do, Pritchard interrupted, his voice now loud enough to carry throughout the entire building. You don't get to walk into my facility and tell me how to run things. You want to file a complaint? Go ahead. There's a comment box by the front door. Write down how unfair you think I'm being. I'm sure someone will get around to reading it eventually. The contempt in his voice made it clear what he thought of complaints. This was a man who had operated without accountability for so long that he genuinely believed himself untouchable. Sergeant Carlyle, still watching from his position down the corridor, wore an expression of barely concealed amusement. Whatever was about to happen, he was enjoying the show. I don't want to file a complaint, Claudia said, keeping her voice steady. I want to help that veteran who just left. She came here for assistance and instead got humiliated in front of a room full of people. She got consequences for failing to follow procedures. That's how the real world works. Actions have consequences. Or did they not teach you that in your 8 years of supposedly honorable service? The skepticism in his voice when he said supposedly was unmistakable. He was now openly questioning her service record, challenging her credibility in front of witnesses who might later be called to account for what they observed and did nothing about. Specialist Caldwell had abandoned her attempt to stop the older veteran from leaving and now stood frozen between her office and the confrontation, her face pale. She looked toward the corridor where Captain Garrison had disappeared, clearly hoping he might return and defuse the situation. But Felix was deliberately staying away. This needed to play out, needed to be documented in its full toxicity. I don't want to file a complaint, Claudia said, keeping her voice steady. I want to help that veteran who just left. She came here for assistance and instead got humiliated in front of a room full of people. She got consequences for failing to follow procedures. That's how the real world works. Actions have consequences. Or did they not teach you that in your 8 years of supposedly honorable service? Pritchard's jaw clenched, a vein becoming visible at his temple. Appropriate professional behavior. You want to talk about appropriate behavior? Look at yourself. You show up here in clothes that belong in a thrift store, demanding services you haven't earned the right to access, and then you have the audacity to judge how I maintain discipline in my facility? Your facility? Claudia's eyebrows rose. I was under the impression this was a United States Army facility meant to serve all veterans, not your personal kingdom. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Claudia saw Pritchard's expression shift. She had challenged not just his methods, but his authority, his ownership of the space he'd claimed as his domain. Some invisible line had been crossed. That's it, Pritchard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that was somehow more menacing than his previous volume. You need to leave now. I have an appointment with Specialist Caldwell. Captain Garrison authorized it. I don't care what Captain Garrison authorized. I'm the senior NCO in this facility, and I'm telling you to leave. You're disruptive, you're disrespectful, and you're not welcome here. Corporal Bradshaw shifted uncomfortably, finally finding his voice. Staff Sergeant, maybe we should... Did I ask for your input, Corporal? Pritchard snapped without taking his eyes off Claudia. When I want your opinion, I'll tell you what it is.
Bradshaw's mouth closed, his expression settling into careful neutrality. Whatever impulse he'd felt to intervene had been thoroughly crushed. This was how toxic cultures sustain themselves, through fear, through demonstrated consequences for those who dared to challenge the established order. I'm not leaving, Claudia said quietly. I'm a veteran seeking assistance at a facility that exists specifically to provide that assistance. I haven't violated any rules or regulations. I haven't been disrespectful. I've simply pointed out that screaming at someone who got lost is inappropriate. Pritchard pulled out his radio. Security, this is Staff Sergeant Pritchard at the Veterans Integration Center. I need someone to remove a disruptive individual from the facility. The radio crackled. Copy that, Staff Sergeant. Nature of the disruption. Civilian refusing to follow lawful orders to leave the premises. Possible impersonation of a veteran. Send someone immediately. The accusation of impersonation landed like a grenade. Around the corridor, the watching soldiers' expressions shifted from uncomfortable observation to shock. Claiming to be a veteran when you weren't was both a legal issue and a profound moral violation in military culture. Pritchard had just escalated from administrative authority to criminal allegation. I'm not impersonating anyone, Claudia said, her voice tight with controlled anger. I have my DD-214 right here in my paperwork. Anyone can print a fake DD-214, Pritchard countered. Real veterans don't show up looking like homeless people and causing scenes. Real veterans understand discipline and respect for authority. Specialist Caldwell finally found her voice. Staff Sergeant, I reviewed her documentation. It appears legitimate. I don't think... Specialist, get back to your office, Pritchard ordered. This doesn't concern you anymore. But sir, that's an order, Specialist Caldwell. Caldwell's face flushed, anger and frustration warring with military discipline.
After a moment's hesitation, she retreated to her office but remained visible through the glass wall, her phone now in her hand. Claudia suspected she was texting Captain Garrison, trying to summon help before the situation deteriorated further. Through the front windows, Claudia could see a military police vehicle pulling into the parking lot. 2 MPs emerged, their presence transforming this from an internal dispute to an official incident. Pritchard's expression carried unmistakable satisfaction. He was winning, asserting his authority, demonstrating what happened to people who challenged his control. The MPs entered the building, their expressions professionally neutral. Staff Sergeant Pritchard, you called about a disruptive individual. This woman, Pritchard gestured at Claudia, she came in without an appointment, became argumentative when I explained our procedures, and is now refusing a lawful order to leave the facility. I have reason to believe she may be falsely claiming veteran status. One of the MPs, a sergeant with kind eyes and a name tape reading Hassan, turned to Claudia. Ma'am, can you explain your version of events? Claudia saw her opportunity. This could end now. She could reveal her identity, produce her credentials, and watch Pritchard's world collapse in real time. But revealing herself too early would compromise the larger investigation. There were patterns here that needed fuller documentation, other victims who needed validation, systemic issues that required comprehensive evidence. I am a veteran, Claudia explained calmly. I came here seeking assistance with my disability claim. Staff Sergeant Pritchard was rude and dismissive. When I witnessed him verbally attacking another veteran, I intervened. That's when he ordered me to leave and called you. Sergeant Hassan's expression suggested he was already forming his own assessment of the situation, but his partner, a younger specialist, seemed more inclined to accept Pritchard's authority at face value.
Ma'am, do you have identification? Sergeant Hassan asked, his tone professional but not unkind. Claudia reached into her bag, her movements deliberate and calm. She could feel Pritchard's satisfaction radiating across the corridor. He thought this was his victory, his demonstration of power, his lesson to anyone who dared question his authority. She withdrew her wallet and handed it to Hassan. Hassan examined her driver's license, then looked at the DD-214 Specialist Caldwell had left on her desk, visible through the glass wall. His partner leaned in to look as well, comparing documents. Ms. Shepherd, your documentation appears to be in order. You are a veteran. Of course I am, Claudia said quietly. I've never claimed otherwise. Pritchard stepped forward, his voice carrying renewed authority. Paperwork can be forged. I've seen it before. People who want to access veteran services they haven't earned. Hassan's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of irritation at having his professional assessment questioned. But before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the administrative corridor. Captain Felix Garrison emerged, his expression carefully controlled, followed by a figure whose presence immediately transformed the atmosphere in the building. Major Hugh Randolph, the 3rd Battalion's executive officer, commanded attention simply by existing in a space. At 52, with silver threading through his dark hair and a chest full of combat decorations, he radiated the kind of authority that came from 30 years of military service. He was also, according to Felix's reports, Staff Sergeant Pritchard's primary enabler, the officer who had ignored multiple complaints, who had consistently sided with his senior NCO regardless of evidence, who had created the climate where abuse could flourish. What's going on here? Randolph demanded, his gaze sweeping across the assembled personnel. Staff Sergeant Pritchard. Pritchard straightened immediately, his posture shifting to rigid military bearing. Sir, I have a disruptive civilian who refused to leave the facility when ordered. I called security to have her removed. Randolph's attention fixed on Claudia, his expression skeptical. Are you refusing lawful orders? I'm a veteran seeking assistance, Claudia replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Staff Sergeant Pritchard was verbally abusing another veteran. When I pointed out that his behavior was inappropriate, he ordered me to leave and accused me of impersonating a veteran. Staff Sergeant Pritchard maintains discipline in this facility, Randolph said, his tone making clear whose account he credited. If he determined your presence was disruptive— Major Randolph, Captain Garrison interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable significance. Before this goes any further, there's something you should know about Miss Shepherd. Randolph turned, irritation evident. Captain, I'm handling the situation. Sir, with respect, you need to see her credentials. All of them.
Something in Felix's tone penetrated Randolph's certainty. His expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "What are you talking about, Captain?" Felix looked at Claudia, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. The investigation had gathered what it needed: 17 complaints validated, toxic culture documented, abuse of authority witnessed by multiple personnel. It was time. Claudia reached into her bag again, this time withdrawing a leather credential case she'd kept carefully concealed. She opened it and held it up for Randolph and Pritchard to see. The gold badge caught the fluorescent lighting, and beside it, her military identification card displayed her rank clearly: Lieutenant Colonel Claudia Shepherd, Office of the Inspector General.
The silence that followed was absolute. Pritchard's face underwent a remarkable transformation: confusion, then recognition, then dawning horror as the full implications cascaded through his mind. Randolph stood frozen, the color draining from his complexion. "Lieutenant Colonel," Sergeant Hassan said quietly, snapping to attention. His partner followed suit immediately. "As you were," Claudia said, though her tone had shifted subtly. The uncertain veteran seeking help had vanished, replaced by an officer whose authority was now unmistakable. She turned to Pritchard, whose mouth was opening and closing soundlessly. "Staff Sergeant Pritchard, I am conducting an investigation on behalf of the Inspector General into allegations of toxic leadership and abuse of authority within the 3rd Battalion's administrative section. Everything that has occurred here today has been observed and will be documented in my report." Pritchard tried to speak, his voice emerging as a croak. "Ma'am, I thought... You thought I was just another veteran you could intimidate, someone without power or connections, someone whose complaints you could dismiss or ignore." She turned to address the assembled personnel, her voice carrying through the corridor. "But here's what you all need to understand. It shouldn't matter who I am. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. The fact that you only showed concern when you learned my rank proves exactly what's wrong with this command climate." Randolph had recovered enough to attempt damage control. "Lieutenant Colonel, there's been a misunderstanding. Staff Sergeant Pritchard was simply maintaining facility discipline." "Major, I suggest you stop talking," Claudia interrupted, her voice sharp. "I observed you arrive on scene, hear that a veteran was being removed from the facility, and immediately side with Staff Sergeant Pritchard without asking any questions or examining any evidence. That response tells me everything I need to know about why 17 formal complaints have been filed against this section." The number landed like a physical blow. Around the corridor, soldiers exchanged glances, some shocked, some grimly unsurprised, all recognizing that something significant was unfolding. Randolph's jaw tightened. 17 complaints? 17, Claudia confirmed, from both active duty personnel and veterans, all describing a pattern of intimidation, discrimination, and abuse of authority, all ignored or dismissed by the chain of command. That's why I'm here, Major, not just to investigate Staff Sergeant Pritchard, but to understand how this culture was allowed to develop and persist. Through the glass wall, Specialist Caldwell stood with her hand over her mouth, tears visible on her cheeks. Corporal Bradshaw's expression suggested a mixture of vindication and grief. Finally, someone with authority was acknowledging what they'd all known but felt powerless to change. "I want everyone who witnessed today's events to remain available. You'll each be interviewed as part of this investigation. And let me be very clear, there will be no retaliation against anyone who provides honest testimony. Anyone who attempts such retaliation will face additional charges." Pritchard seemed to shrink physically, his earlier aggressive confidence collapsing into something that looked like panic. "Ma'am, if I had known who you were—" "That's exactly the problem, Staff Sergeant. Your behavior shouldn't depend on who someone is or what rank they hold. It should be guided by basic human decency and professional standards. Standards you abandoned a long time ago." The Veterans Integration Center had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, though the violations being documented were of policy and human dignity rather than law. Soldiers who moments ago had been spectators to Pritchard's performance now stood as witnesses to his downfall, their expressions ranging from shock to carefully concealed satisfaction. The two MPs remained at detention, their presence shifting from enforcement of Pritchard's will to protection of the investigation's integrity. Sergeant Hassan cleared his throat. "Ma'am, do you require our continued presence?" Claudia considered for a moment. "Yes, Sergeant. Please remain available. I'll need statements from both of you about what you observed when you arrived." She turned to the assembled personnel. "In fact, I need everyone who witnessed any part of today's events to remain in the building. Captain Garrison will coordinate interview times." Felix nodded, producing a small notebook from his pocket. The gesture was purely procedural. He'd been documenting everything electronically from his concealed position down the corridor, but the visible note-taking served a psychological purpose. It reminded everyone present that their actions, their words, even their silence, would become part of an official record. Pritchard stood frozen in the center of the corridor. His earlier aggressive confidence completely evaporated. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, and a sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead, despite the building's efficient climate control. "Ma'am," he began again, his voice unsteady, "I apologize for my behavior. If I had realized—" "Stop," Claudia interrupted, raising one hand. "Don't finish that sentence, Staff Sergeant, because anything that starts with, 'if I had realized,' only confirms that your respect for people is conditional on their rank or status. That's not an apology. That's a confession of exactly what's wrong with your leadership." Major Randolph had recovered some of his composure, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed his internal calculations. He was a career officer, facing the potential destruction of everything he'd built over 3 decades. "Lieutenant Colonel, I understand your concerns. However, I believe context is important here. Staff Sergeant Pritchard has served with distinction for 12 years. He's deployed 3 times, earned a Bronze Star, and has consistently received excellent performance evaluations." "From you," Claudia noted. "He's received excellent evaluations from you, Major. Meanwhile, 17 people felt unsafe enough in this environment to bypass their entire chain of command and file formal complaints with the Inspector General. What does that tell you about the accuracy of those evaluations?" Randolph's jaw clenched, but he maintained his diplomatic tone. "Disgruntled personnel exist in any organization, ma'am. Not everyone can handle military standards." "Don't," Claudia said, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. "Don't you dare blame the victims for having the courage to report abuse. I've read every single complaint, Major. They're detailed, specific, and corroborated by multiple independent sources. This isn't about high standards. This is about a toxic environment where power is weaponized against the vulnerable." Through the glass wall of her office, Specialist Caldwell had composed herself enough to emerge. Her face was pale but determined. "Ma'am, if I may speak?" Claudia turned to her, noting the visible courage it took for a junior enlisted soldier to insert herself into a confrontation involving field-grade officers and senior NCOs. "Specialist Caldwell, please." "I've worked in this facility for 8 months. I've watched Staff Sergeant Pritchard treat veterans and soldiers with contempt almost daily. I've seen people leave in tears. I've heard him mock soldiers' mental health concerns and dismiss veterans' disability claims as exaggerated or fraudulent. I've wanted to report it, but—" She glanced at Randolph. "Every time someone tried to raise concerns, they were told they were being too sensitive or that they needed to develop thicker skin."
Randolph's expression hardened. "Specialist, this is neither the time nor the place. Actually, Major, this is exactly the time and place," Claudia interjected. "Specialist Caldwell, did you personally witness Major Randolph dismiss concerns about Staff Sergeant Pritchard's behavior?" Caldwell hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Yes, ma'am. 3 months ago, Corporal Bradshaw reported that Staff Sergeant Pritchard had berated a female veteran so severely that she had a panic attack in a parking lot. Major Randolph told him that the staff sergeant was maintaining appropriate standards and that if Corporal Bradshaw couldn't handle a professional environment, perhaps he should reconsider his career path." Corporal Bradshaw, who had been standing silently near the reception desk, flinched at hearing his experience recounted publicly, but he didn't contradict Caldwell's account. Instead, he nodded slowly, his expression suggesting both vindication and old pain being freshly acknowledged. "That's a lie," Randolph said, but the conviction in his voice had weakened. "I never said anything like that." "I can provide the email thread, sir," Bradshaw said quietly. "I documented it because I was afraid of retaliation. Your exact words were, 'Staff Sergeant Pritchard maintains discipline in this facility with my full support. If you cannot handle
a professional military environment, you should consider whether you're suited for continued service. The corridor had become a courtroom, with witnesses stepping forward to provide testimony that had been suppressed for months or years. Sergeant Carlyle, who had been watching Pritchard's performance with amusement earlier, now looked like he desperately wanted to be anywhere else. His association with Pritchard, his visible approval of the toxic behavior, had just become a significant liability. Sergeant Carlyle, Claudia addressed him directly, you were present during today's incident. You watched Staff Sergeant Pritchard verbally assault 2 veterans, and you smiled. Do you find abuse of authority amusing? Carlyle's face flushed. Ma'am, I didn't realize it was, or you didn't realize there would be consequences. The distinction was important. It separated those who genuinely didn't understand the impact of their behavior from those who simply believed they'd never be held accountable. Carlyle's silence suggested he fell into the latter category. Captain Garrison had been taking notes throughout, but now he looked up. Ma'am, I have preliminary interview times arranged. Should we use the conference room? Yes, Claudia confirmed. We'll start with Specialist Caldwell, then Corporal Bradshaw, then the MPs who responded. Staff Sergeant Pritchard and Major Randolph, you're both confined to this facility until I've completed initial interviews. You will not discuss this investigation with each other or with any potential witnesses. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am, Pritchard managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Randolph's expression had shifted from defensive to calculating. Lieutenant Colonel, I would like to contact my chain of command. Your chain of command is already aware, Claudia informed him. Colonel Blackwell received notification of this investigation when it was opened 6 weeks ago. She's been briefed on the allegations and has authorized full cooperation with the Inspector General's office. If you wish to contact a military attorney, that's your right, but you will not be contacting anyone else until I've completed my initial investigation. The revelation that his base commander had known about the investigation, had authorized it, had been briefed on allegations against him, that information seemed to hit Randolph harder than anything else. His face went pale as he realized how completely isolated he had become.
The conference room at Fort Braxton's headquarters building bore little resemblance to the Veterans Integration Center, where the confrontation had unfolded hours earlier. Here, dark wood paneling and formal military portraits created an atmosphere of institutional gravity. Colonel Diane Blackwell sat at the head of the table, her silver eagles catching the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. At 55, she commanded Fort Braxton with a reputation for fairness, tempered by zero tolerance for leadership failures. Claudia sat to the colonel's right, her investigation notes organized in neat folders before her. Captain Garrison occupied the seat beside her, his laptop open to the detailed timeline they'd constructed. Across the table, Major Randolph sat with his military attorney, a sharp-eyed JAG captain named Morrison, who'd spent the past 3 hours reviewing the evidence compiled against his client. Staff Sergeant Pritchard sat at the far end with his own representation, looking diminished in a way that went beyond physical presence. "Let me make sure I understand what I've read correctly," Colonel Blackwell began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that required no volume to command attention. "Lieutenant Colonel Shepherd, you documented 17 separate incidents of hostile behavior toward veterans and soldiers over the course of a single day?" "Not quite, ma'am. I documented Staff Sergeant Pritchard's behavior toward 2 veterans and observed the command climate that enables such behavior. The 17 complaints I referenced were filed over the past 8 months by different individuals. Today's investigation was designed to verify whether those complaints reflected systemic issues or isolated incidents." "And your conclusion?" "The complaints are valid, ma'am. What I witnessed today represents standard operating procedure for the Veterans Integration Center under Staff Sergeant Pritchard's management and Major Randolph's oversight. Multiple witnesses have now provided corroborating testimony describing similar incidents occurring regularly." Colonel Blackwell turned her attention to Randolph. "Major, you've served under my command for 2 years. Your performance evaluations have been consistently strong. Help me understand how this situation developed without you recognizing or addressing it. Randolph's attorney leaned forward. Ma'am, if I may, my client maintains that Staff Sergeant Pritchard's leadership style, while perhaps overly direct, was consistent with maintaining discipline and accountability. Captain Morrison, the colonel interrupted, her tone polite but firm. I'm not asking for a legal defense. I'm asking your client to explain his judgment as a leader. Major Randolph. Randolph cleared his throat, his composure noticeably fragile. Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Pritchard is a decorated combat veteran with an exceptional service record. When concerns were raised, I evaluated them in the context of his overall performance and combat experience. Some soldiers, particularly newer personnel, can misinterpret strong leadership as hostility. Specialist Caldwell has 6 years of service and a deployment to Iraq. Corporal Bradshaw is a Bronze Star recipient. These aren't newer personnel misunderstanding strong leadership. These are experienced soldiers recognizing abuse of authority. Colonel Blackwell raised her hand, forestalling further debate. I've reviewed the interview transcripts. 8 separate witnesses, soldiers and civilians, described a pattern of behavior that goes beyond strong leadership. Staff Sergeant Pritchard, do you dispute the factual accuracy of what the lieutenant colonel observed today? Pritchard's attorney, a senior NCO from the Legal Assistance Office, whispered something to him. Pritchard shook his head slightly before responding. Ma'am, I don't dispute the lieutenant colonel's observations, but I believed I was maintaining appropriate standards for the facility. By accusing a legitimate veteran of impersonation? By calling military police to remove someone who is following proper procedures for seeking assistance? By creating an environment where soldiers are afraid to report concerns?
Ma'am, I made an error in judgment today, Pritchard admitted, his voice strained. But my intentions were to protect the facility's integrity. Your intentions, Colonel Blackwell interrupted, are less relevant than your impact. And the impact of your leadership has been to create an environment antithetical to everything this installation should represent. She opened a folder before her, scanning a document that Claudia recognized as the summary brief she'd prepared. Staff Sergeant Pritchard, effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties related to the Veterans Integration Center. You will be reassigned to duties that involve no contact with veterans or soldiers seeking assistance. Your evaluation report for this rating period will reflect the findings of this investigation. Additionally, you will attend mandatory leadership courses focusing on appropriate treatment of subordinates and customers. Pritchard's face had gone gray, but he managed a hoarse, "Yes, ma'am." The colonel turned her attention to Randolph. Major, your situation is more complex. As the field-grade officer responsible for oversight, you failed to identify and address a toxic environment that developed under your watch. Multiple soldiers attempted to bring concerns to your attention, and you dismissed them. That represents a fundamental failure of leadership judgment. Ma'am, Randolph's attorney interjected, my client followed established procedures for addressing complaints. No, Colonel Blackwell said flatly. He followed procedures for dismissing complaints. There's a difference. Major Randolph, you will be removed from your current position. A formal investigation will determine what additional administrative actions are appropriate, but at minimum, you will receive a negative evaluation and will not be eligible for command positions for the remainder of your career. The words landed with the finality of a judge's gavel. Randolph's shoulders sagged, the weight of 3 decades of service potentially ending in disgrace settling visibly upon him. However, the colonel continued, punishment without reform accomplishes nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Shepherd, you've made recommendations in your preliminary report about systemic changes. Please summarize them. Claudia opened her tablet, pulling up her notes. Ma'am, I recommend 3 primary actions. First, mandatory training for all personnel in customer service positions, focusing on bias recognition and appropriate treatment regardless of appearance or perceived status. Second, establishment of an independent feedback mechanism where veterans can report concerns without fear of retaliation. Third, regular climate assessments of the Veterans Integration Center conducted by personnel outside the chain of command. Approved, Colonel Blackwell said without hesitation. Captain Garrison, you'll coordinate implementation. I want the training program operational within 30 days. She turned to Claudia. What else? The veteran who Staff Sergeant Pritchard verbally assaulted before my arrival, the woman who was late due to getting lost on post. I'd like to contact her, apologize on behalf of the installation, and ensure she receives the assistance she came seeking. Make it happen, the colonel ordered. Felix, coordinate with Lieutenant Colonel Shepherd to identify that veteran and personally ensure she receives appropriate support. She paused, her expression softening slightly. Anything else? Claudia hesitated, then decided to voice what had been troubling her since the investigation began. Ma'am, 17 complaints over 8 months suggests that soldiers and veterans overcame tremendous barriers to report these issues. They deserve to know their voices mattered, that coming forward wasn't in vain. Colonel Blackwell nodded slowly. Agreed. We'll issue a command-wide message acknowledging that concerns were raised, investigated, and addressed. Without naming specific individuals, we'll make clear that retaliation will not be tolerated and that this command values those who have the courage to identify problems.
3 weeks after the confrontation, Claudia returned to Fort Braxton for a follow-up assessment. The Veterans Integration Center had undergone changes both visible and subtle. A new sign near the entrance proclaimed, "All veterans welcome, serving those who served." The waiting area furniture had been rearranged to feel less institutional and more inviting. But the real transformation existed in something harder to quantify. The atmosphere itself felt different, lighter, as though a oppressive weight had been lifted. Specialist Caldwell met Claudia at the entrance, her demeanor noticeably more confident than their first encounter. "Ma'am, welcome back. Captain Garrison is waiting in the conference room with the rest of the team." The conference room had been repurposed as a planning center for the systemic reforms Colonel Blackwell had ordered. Around the table sat Captain Garrison, Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Park, who had assumed Major Randolph's former role, and several NCOs, including Corporal Bradshaw. Notably absent was any trace of Pritchard's influence. Lieutenant Colonel Shepherd, Park greeted her warmly. He was younger than Randolph by a decade, with a reputation for valuing input from subordinates and actually listening to feedback. "Thank you for coming back. We wanted to brief you on implementation progress and get your assessment of how we're doing." Claudia took a seat, noting the relaxed but professional atmosphere. "I'm eager to hear what you've accomplished." Felix pulled up a presentation on the conference room screen. "First, the training program. We've completed bias recognition and customer service training for 100% of personnel assigned to the Veterans Integration Center. The curriculum was adapted from civilian customer service best practices combined with military values training." "How was it received?" Claudia asked. Corporal Bradshaw answered, "Honestly, ma'am, there was some skepticism at first. Some people thought it was just checking a box after what happened with Staff Sergeant Pritchard. But the instructors were good. They used real scenarios, including some that people recognized from this facility. By the end, even the skeptics were admitting they'd learned something." "The independent feedback mechanism is operational," Felix continued, advancing to the next slide. "We've established a dedicated email address monitored by the Inspector General's office and a suggestion box that's emptied daily by personnel outside the chain of command. We've already received 12 pieces of feedback, 4 compliments, 6 suggestions for improvement, and 2 concerns that we've addressed immediately." Lieutenant Colonel Park leaned forward. The concerns were both about wait times and scheduling, nothing approaching the level of hostility we saw before, but the fact that people felt comfortable raising issues suggests the system is working. Claudia nodded, pleased but cautious. "And the climate assessments?" "We've conducted 2 so far," Park replied, 1 week after the changes were implemented and another last week. Both show significant improvement in how veterans and soldiers perceive the facility.
The qualitative comments are particularly telling. People mentioned feeling welcomed and respected in ways they didn't before. Specialist Caldwell cleared her throat. Ma'am, if I may add something from the ground level, the biggest change isn't the new policies or training. It's that people see leaders actually caring about feedback. Lieutenant Colonel Park spent his first week here sitting in the waiting room, watching how we interact with veterans, and then asking us what barriers we face in providing good service. That's never happened before. Park smiled slightly. It seemed like a logical first step. Understand the operation before trying to fix it.
It was revolutionary, Bradshaw corrected gently. Most leaders tell us how things should work. You asked us how things actually work. The exchange illustrated something Claudia had emphasized in her final report, that sustainable cultural change required leaders who valued input from those closest to the work. What about Staff Sergeant Pritchard and Major Randolph? Have there been any issues with their reassignments? Felix shook his head. Pritchard is working in supply operations with no customer-facing responsibilities. By all accounts, he's performing adequately when he's not in a position of power over vulnerable people. Randolph has been reassigned to an administrative role at headquarters. He's eligible for retirement in 18 months and will likely take it. And retaliation concerns? Claudia pressed. Anyone who testified in the investigation experiencing problems? None reported, Park confirmed. I've personally checked in with each witness. Colonel Blackwell has been clear throughout the command that retaliation in any form will result in immediate relief and potential criminal charges. The conversation shifted to longer-term improvements, a partnership with local veteran service organizations to provide more comprehensive support, a mentorship program pairing experienced veterans with those newly transitioning out of service, enhanced training for all Fort Braxton personnel on recognizing and addressing toxic leadership. There's something else, Felix said, pulling up a final slide. Remember the veteran who Staff Sergeant Pritchard verbally assaulted? The woman who got lost and was late for her appointment? We tracked her down. Her name is Margaret Wilson, and she served in the Army for 22 years before retiring as a Master Sergeant. Claudia felt a chill. A Master Sergeant, an E8, one of the most senior enlisted ranks. Someone with more than 2 decades of service, treated with contempt because she arrived in modest civilian clothes and was late due to an understandable reason. We reached out to her, Felix continued. Initially, she was reluctant to engage. She assumed we were trying to protect the institution's reputation. But Lieutenant Colonel Park spoke with her personally, apologized on behalf of Fort Braxton, and offered to personally assist with whatever she needed. She came in last week. We spent 2 hours going over her employment resources. She's now connected with a veteran hiring program and has 2 job interviews lined up. But more importantly, she said something that stuck with me. She said, I spent 22 years serving my country. I deployed 4 times. I earned the right to be treated with dignity, not based on my rank or my clothes, but based on my service and my humanity. The words settled over the room like a benediction. That was the core of it. Not rank, not appearance, not social status, but fundamental human dignity. Claudia stood, preparing to conduct her walkthrough of the facility. You've made remarkable progress in 3 weeks, but this can't be a sprint followed by backsliding. Toxic cultures develop over time, and they can redevelop just as easily if leaders aren't vigilant. Understood, ma'am, Park replied. I've requested that the Inspector General's office conduct quarterly assessments for the next 2 years. I want external accountability to keep us honest. The request surprised Claudia. Leaders rarely invited that level of scrutiny. It suggested Park understood something his predecessor had not, that accountability wasn't a threat to good leadership, it was a foundation of it. As the conversation concluded, Specialist Caldwell approached Claudia privately. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you personally. What you did that day, standing up to Staff Sergeant Pritchard, revealing who you were, making sure people knew their complaints mattered, it changed everything for those of us who work here. You were the one who came forward when it mattered, Specialist. That took real courage. It took seeing someone model the courage first, Caldwell replied softly. 6 months had passed since the confrontation that had transformed the Veterans Integration Center. Claudia sat in a small coffee shop in Richmond, Virginia, watching the autumn rain streak down the windows. Across from her sat someone she never expected to see again, Staff Sergeant Damon Pritchard, now in civilian clothes, looking significantly different from the aggressive, intimidating figure who had commanded the center like a personal domain. Pritchard had reached out through Captain Garrison, asking if Claudia would be willing to meet,
She'd agreed, curious about what had motivated the request and prepared for anything from a defensive justification to an attempt at manipulation. What she encountered was something else entirely. "Thank you for meeting me, ma'am," Pritchard said, his voice carrying none of its former edge. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm willing to listen," Claudia replied neutrally. "Captain Garrison said you wanted to talk." Pritchard wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, his gaze fixed on the dark liquid. "I've spent the last 6 months in therapy, not because the Army required it, though they did, but because I finally realized I needed it. What happened that day, what you witnessed, what you documented, I couldn't deny it anymore." Claudia remained silent, letting him continue. "I thought I was being a strong leader," Pritchard said, his voice rough with emotion. "I deployed 3 times. I saw things, did things that changed me. When I came back, I thought toughness was the only way to maintain standards. I thought showing compassion or flexibility was weakness, but really I was just perpetuating the same toxic behavior I'd experienced and telling myself it was discipline." "What changed?" Claudia asked. Pritchard looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "My daughter. She's 16 now. A few months ago, she came home crying because a teacher had humiliated her in front of her class for asking a question. She said she felt small, powerless, like nothing she did would ever be good enough." He paused, his jaw working. "And I heard myself in that teacher. I heard how I'd made people feel. Veterans who'd served their country, soldiers trying their best, people who just needed help and instead got my contempt." The confession was raw and painful to witness. Claudia saw genuine remorse in Pritchard's expression, but she also knew that understanding the harm you'd caused was only the beginning of redemption, not its completion. "The therapy helped me understand something. I was dealing with my own trauma by inflicting it on others. I felt powerless in combat, so I sought power over people in garrison. I felt judged for my PTSD, so I judged others for any perceived weakness. It doesn't excuse what I did, but it explains it." "What are you doing now?" Claudia asked. "I'm working in supply, like you know, but I've also started volunteering with a veteran peer support group. Other combat vets dealing with the transition home, the anger, the hypervigilance, all of it." He met my gaze again. "I'm trying to help people process what I never processed properly, trying to break the cycle instead of perpetuating it." Claudia absorbed this information, weighing his words against her natural skepticism. People could change, but they could also perform change convincingly while remaining fundamentally the same. "Have you reached out to any of the people you hurt, the veterans you turned away, the soldiers you intimidated?"
Pritchard nodded slowly. "I've tried. Some won't talk to me, which I understand and respect, but Master Sergeant Wilson, the woman who was late that day, she agreed to meet me. I apologized to her, not to make myself feel better, but because she deserved to hear it. I told her that her service mattered, that she deserved respect, and that my behavior was inexcusable." "How did she respond?" "She told me that forgiveness wasn't something I could ask for or expect, but that she appreciated the acknowledgement." Pritchard's smile was sad. "She also said that the best apology would be changed behavior, being different with the next person who needs help. So that's what I'm trying to do." The coffee shop hummed with quiet conversation around them. Outside, the rain had intensified, creating a cocoon of sound that made their conversation feel separate from the rest of the world. "Why did you want to meet with me?" Claudia finally asked. "What do you hope to accomplish with this conversation?" Pritchard took a long breath. "2 things. First, I wanted you to know that what you did that day, standing up to me, revealing the investigation, holding me accountable, it was the best thing that could have happened to me. I was on a path that would have destroyed my career, my family, and whatever was left of my soul. You stopped that. And second, I wanted to ask if there was any way I could help with your work, not to rehabilitate my reputation or get my old job back. I know that's not happening, But if there's value in having someone who understands how toxic leadership develops, who can speak to other NCOs about recognizing those patterns in themselves, I'd like to contribute. The offer surprised Claudia. She studied Pritchard carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or self-interest. What she saw instead was exhaustion, humility, and something that looked like genuine hope that some good might come from his worst moment. The Inspector General's office is developing a leadership ethics course. Part of it involves case studies of leadership failures. Your situation would be relevant, though it would require you to be honest about your behavior and its impact. I can do that, Pritchard said immediately. If my failure can help other leaders avoid making the same mistakes, then maybe something positive comes from all the harm I caused. Claudia made a note on her phone. I'll discuss it with Lieutenant General Vaughn. No promises, but we'll consider it. She looked at Pritchard directly. But understand this. Redemption isn't a destination. It's a direction. You don't arrive at forgiveness or absolution. You spend the rest of your career, your life, moving toward being better than you were. I understand, ma'am. As they prepared to leave, Pritchard hesitated. One more thing. Specialist Caldwell. I wrote her an apology letter. I never sent it because I didn't want to burden her with my guilt. But I want you to know that I recognize that she showed more courage in one day than I showed in 12 years. She spoke truth to power when it mattered, and I tried to silence her. That's something I have to live with. Claudia stood, gathering her coat. Specialist Caldwell is thriving in her new position. She's being recommended for promotion and has become a mentor to junior soldiers. She doesn't need your letter, but she might appreciate knowing that you recognize what she did. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle. Pritchard extended his hand, and, after a moment's consideration, Claudia shook it. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement that people could choose different paths forward.
1 year after the incident at the Veterans Integration Center, Fort Braxton hosted its first annual Veteran Support Conference. The base theater was filled with over 300 attendees, veterans, active duty personnel, representatives from veteran service organizations, and military leaders from installations across the region. The event represented a dramatic shift in how Fort Braxton approached veteran services, transforming from a reluctant obligation into a celebrated priority. Claudia sat in the front row alongside Colonel Blackwell and Lieutenant General Preston Aldridge, who had traveled from the Inspector General's headquarters to witness the results of an investigation that had sparked reforms far beyond a single facility. Captain Felix Garrison, recently promoted to major, sat on the stage preparing to moderate a panel discussion. The morning had featured several presentations, but the session Claudia anticipated most was about to begin. Felix stood at the podium, his voice carrying through the theater's sound system. Our next panel focuses on creating inclusive veteran services. We have a distinguished group of speakers who bring different perspectives to this critical topic. He introduced the panelists one by one. Master Sergeant Margaret Wilson, now employed as a veteran transition coordinator at a major corporation, spoke about her experience on both sides of the veteran services equation. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Park discussed the systemic changes implemented at Fort Braxton and their measurable impact. Specialist Amber Caldwell, recently promoted to sergeant, represented the frontline service providers who interacted with veterans daily. And then, unexpectedly, Felix introduced a final panelist. Our last speaker brings a perspective that's crucial, but often missing from these conversations. Someone who experienced the consequences of toxic leadership and chose to transform that experience into positive change. Please welcome Mr. Damon Pritchard. Pritchard walked onto the stage in a suit that hung slightly loose on his frame, as though he'd lost weight during his year of transformation. The audience's reaction was mixed. Some shifted uncomfortably, aware of his history, while others leaned forward with curiosity.
Claudia noted that Master Sergeant Wilson watched him with an expression that suggested she'd known he would be speaking and had made peace with sharing the stage. Felix began with a question directed at Wilson. Master Sergeant, you experienced firsthand what happens when veteran services fail to maintain appropriate standards of respect. Can you describe what that experience felt like? Wilson's voice was steady and clear. I served 22 years in the Army. I deployed to Iraq twice and Afghanistan once. I mentored dozens of young soldiers and held positions of significant responsibility. But when I walked into that Veterans Integration Center a year ago, all of that meant nothing. I was judged within seconds based on my civilian clothes and the fact that I was late due to getting lost. I felt invisible, dismissed, and profoundly disrespected. She paused. Her gaze moved to Pritchard before returning to the audience. What hurt most wasn't the anger or the harsh words. It was the feeling that my service didn't matter, that all those years of sacrifice counted for nothing if I didn't present myself in the exact way someone expected. That's not how we should treat people who wore the uniform. Felix turned to Park. Lieutenant Colonel, when you assumed leadership of the Veterans Integration Center, what did you find and how did you approach changing the culture? Park leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. I found a facility that operated efficiently by certain metrics, processing numbers, maintaining schedules, but had completely lost sight of its mission. The culture prioritized process over people, control over compassion. My approach was to involve the people actually doing the work in identifying problems and developing solutions. Sergeant Caldwell, how would you describe that process? Caldwell, still adjusting to her recent promotion and the attention that came with being on stage, spoke with growing confidence. Lieutenant Colonel Park did something radical. He asked us what we needed to do our jobs better, not what we should need according to some regulation, but what actually worked in practice. He spent time observing, listening, and trusting that we knew our jobs. That trust changed everything. She glanced at Pritchard, her expression complex. I won't pretend the previous environment didn't cause real harm. It did. People left in tears. Veterans gave up on getting help. Soldiers developed anxiety about coming to work. But acknowledging that harm is the first step toward healing it.
Felix let the statement settle before addressing Pritchard directly. Mr. Pritchard, you are at the center of the leadership failures we're discussing. That's not a comfortable territory. Why did you agree to participate in this panel? Pritchard's hands gripped the edge of the table before him. Because comfortable would be hiding from what I did. Comfortable would be pretending it didn't happen, or that I was just following orders or maintaining standards. But the truth is, I created a toxic environment through my behavior, and people suffered because of it. His voice carried through the silent theater. I deployed 3 times and came back changed in ways I didn't understand or address properly. Instead of dealing with my trauma, I inflicted it on others. I told myself I was being strong, maintaining discipline, upholding standards. Really, I was just hurting people who needed help. He looked at Wilson. Master Sergeant Wilson deserved better. Every veteran who walked through those doors deserved better. Every soldier who worked in that facility deserved better. My failure wasn't just professional, it was moral. I forgot that leadership is about service, not power. The audience had grown completely still. This kind of public accountability was rare in military culture, where admitting failure often meant career death. But Pritchard had already lost his career trajectory. What he was doing now was something different, choosing honesty over self-protection. Felix posed his final question to the full panel. Looking forward, what gives you hope that we can maintain these improvements and prevent similar failures? Wilson answered first. I see hope in leaders like Lieutenant Colonel Park who value feedback over ego.
I see it in young NCOs like Sergeant Caldwell, who refuse to perpetuate toxic patterns. And honestly, I see it in Mr. Pritchard's willingness to face what he did and help others avoid the same mistakes. Accountability creates hope. Park nodded. The systems we've implemented, regular climate assessments, independent feedback mechanisms, mandatory training, these create structures that sustain cultural change beyond individual leaders. But ultimately, it comes down to whether leaders choose to value people over process, compassion over control. Caldwell added, I have hope because I see veterans being treated with dignity now. I see soldiers speaking up when something's wrong. I see a culture where respect isn't conditional on rank or appearance. That's worth protecting. Pritchard spoke last, his voice quiet but clear. I don't presume to offer hope. I'm still earning back trust. But I've learned that change is possible if you're willing to face uncomfortable truths about yourself. If my story helps one leader recognize toxic patterns before they cause harm, then maybe something good comes from my failure. As the conference concluded, Claudia observed the networking that followed. Veterans approached the panelists, sharing their own stories. Leaders from other installations discussed implementing similar reforms. Most striking was watching Wilson and Pritchard engage in what appeared to be a respectful, if not warm, conversation. Not reconciliation, exactly, but acknowledgement of shared humanity despite past harm. Colonel Blackwell approached Claudia as the theater emptied. Your investigation changed more than one facility, Lieutenant Colonel Park. It sparked conversations about veteran services across the entire region. The credit belongs to the 17 people who filed complaints. They showed courage when it was easier to stay silent. They trusted that someone would listen. That trust is what we can't betray. Outside, Fort Braxton's parade grounds stretched under late afternoon sun, soldiers conducting training, vehicles moving with purpose, the ordinary machinery of military life continuing. But something fundamental had shifted, a recognition that dignity wasn't awarded based on rank or status, but inherent in every person who sought to serve or had served. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.